Thanks. I hope everybody can see the screen. So I'll give a very brief introduction before we get to the real reasons why you're here. Just giving a very brief introduction of GEO, what it is, and some information about the working group itself that's organizing the working group. Thanks, Patty. So GEO is a large network. As you can see below here, there's over 2,000 members, and it's all over the world. And the main mission is to acquire information, coordinate, and deliver biodiversity and related services to users, including decision makers and the scientific committee. So it goes all the way from sort of the conceptualizing, developing variables, as well as indicators that can be used in policy. And people are working in different realms of terrestrial, marine, and freshwater systems. And you can see some of the statistics below about where people are, what sort of observation approaches are used, and sort of the gender balance in the group that Maria will talk a bit about later. And the working group itself, as we'll see in the next slide, is one of very many mechanisms of how GEO works. So the several areas here. So we have the management committee and the secretariat that's sitting at the bottom, and it's sitting in Canada, in Montreal at the moment. And there's next to that, there's two mechanisms, the working groups, of which ecosystem services is one, and there's several others. And if you followed the development of the essential biodiversity variables, you will recognize some of these working groups on the side. And then there's sort of national level, regional level, and thematic biodiversity observation networks that are also linked into the community. And finally, an advisory board that's sort of semi-external, but feeds into the structure as well. But the ecosystem services working group itself, as you'll see now in this next slide.
Oh, there you go. No, sorry.
Thanks, Patty. So the working group has several objectives, and some of them include to develop scalable observation systems for ecosystem services, to develop the ecosystem services essential variables, or the essential ecosystem services variables, which is what you're going to be hearing about today. We also want to think about trends, monitoring at different scales, because scale is very important, and to work with policy and the science policy interface as we develop these concepts, as I said earlier, developing from concepts to variables and eventually to indicators that are useful for monitoring progress in biodiversity and ecosystem services. And the goal of the webinar itself, we have three goals here that are, first and foremost, to introduce the concept and try and explore from this as a sort of a call to action to explore some directions for how this can be implemented, and in some cases improved where it's needed, and hopefully also generate some ideas and tasks that the working group itself can take forward, but also the wider community of people interested in ecosystem services monitoring. So we'll hear from the speakers on the screen. So Patty Balvanera in Mexico, Dany is not able to join us, and then we'll hear from Dany Karp at the University of California, Anna Kort in Germany in Dresden, Valia at the University of Athens, Kate Brammer at the University of Alabama, and Ilse at Bolk Instituut. And this webinar is hosted by myself and Maria, who we'll hear from later. And we will, the structure of the webinar is that we will hear from every one of the speakers first, and then we will take the questions and answers after. But please feel free to add your questions in the chat as we go, and we will get back to this at the end of the conversations. Thanks, Patty, and I'm handing officially to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We are really thrilled to have all of you here and to recognize some names of very dear friends that we have not seen in a long time, and also all these new people joining. So we'll be talking about today about the effort to identify these essential ecosystem service variables. You will hear from most of the co-authors of the paper, but unfortunately Dany, Matthias, and Berta are not able to join today, but they were part of this effort. So we will start with the presentation by Dany, who should be showing. My computer does whatever she wants. So sometimes it moves fast and sometimes it doesn't. There you go. So I leave it to you, Dany.
Great, thanks so much, Patty. And thanks everyone for coming today. So I've been tasked with talking a little bit about the origin of our working group. I first joined this working group as a first-year PhD student, right as the working group was beginning. So I've been with the group for a while. Next slide, Patty. And the vision of the group was first outlined in this paper that Heather Tallis wrote in Bioscience back in 2012, right kind of at the beginning of the inception of our group when Heather was leading us. It outlined the core goal of the group, which was basically to deliver information on the status and trends in ecosystem services to science and policymakers from local to global scales. And we would do that through multiple ways: identifying and compiling very different data sources across kind of different timescales and spatial extents of varying quality, identifying data gaps, and then developing protocols for both kind of collecting new data and then bringing all of these different data sets together. This paper, I've got kind of the header of that at the bottom right here. Patty, next slide. And from a very early point, we realized that ecosystem services were going to be a little bit different than some of the other groups in GeoBond, the more biodiversity focused groups, because they are so inherently socio-ecological. And this was kind of conceptualized in that first paper as the ecosystem service supply chain. So we can think about these different stages of delivery for ecosystem services. I've got an illustration here with fisheries tuna as an example here, where we have the kind of purely biophysical realm of just how much tuna there is in the ocean, the supply of this service. And then humans begin to enter into the equation and we start actually using this service. In this case, it could be the amount of tuna captured. And then that delivers actual benefits to people. Maybe it's the profits gained from capturing that tuna or the nutrition gained to local people, whatever those benefits are. And we recognize that in order to develop an important monitoring system, we would need to monitor all stages of that chain. If we didn't know something about, for example, both the supply and the service, then we wouldn't know about the sustainability of the tuna fishery. Maybe the service is going up, we're using more and more, but the actual supply is going down. Next slide. So after kind of laying out that vision, we began kind of developing some ideas about where these data streams could come from. So this table on the top is a table from a book chapter that Patty wrote within the GEO handbook back in 2017, outlining where we might encounter some of this information on ecosystem supply and delivery and value, looking both at national statistics like what's reported in the FAO, remote sensing information, local, more field data, as well as a variety of different types of ecosystem service models. We also then began to try to identify concrete data streams and as a proof of concept, begin to explore how we could look at changes in these ecosystem services over space and time. Here's a paper that I led back in 2015 out of the group kind of attempting to do that. Next slide. Just wait a sec, cool. And at the same time that we were working in kind of creating all of these concepts and identifying different data streams, the broader GeoBond community was arriving at this concept of essential variables. And that's what we're going to spend a lot of time on today. Here, the kind of most broadly essential variables are going to be defined as the minimum data needed to detect change over space or time in some sort of phenomena of interest. It's got to be able to operate across spatial or temporal scales from really local context all the way up to potentially global analyses. And importantly, these variables are sitting right at the interface between primary observations and indicators. So as an example here, borrowing from a paper from Yates et al. In 2019, we could have bird occurrences be the primary observation, people out there collecting data on where they're seeing birds over time. Here's a single species graphed out on the left. And then we can take some models and translate that into trends over time in either their range sizes or population sizes, and that would be the essential variable. Those essential variables can then get further kind of integrated together to develop indicators that might inform policy decisions. So for example, in this context, maybe we integrate a bunch of different bird species together to develop the farmland bird index, which has been showing declines. This is some data from the UK. And so those essential variables, that effort, really came to a head in 2013 with the paper that Henri Pereira put together, with a big group of folks, when they developed these essential biodiversity variables to provide this framework for tracking biodiversity change over space and time. Next slide. And initially, within that sort of broader GeoBond EBV meeting, there was this effort to integrate the ecosystem service variables sort of either within the EBV context or to even be derived from them. So for example, potentially we could get information about pollination by looking at trends in pollinators over space or time. But as I mentioned earlier, ecosystem services pose unique challenges that sort of set them apart from the broader EBV framework, namely because of their inherent kind of socio-ecological nature. We need to know a lot about the human demand, the kind of benefits deriving from them in order to track ecosystem services over time. And so ultimately, it was decided that they were kind of outside of the realm of the EBV framework, which set up this effort by our group to begin to try to develop our own set of essential ecosystem service variables. So with that, I'll say next slide and hand it off, I think, to the next speaker, Ilse.
Thanks, Dany. Yeah, so my name is Ilse Geijzendorffer, and I have been working on EBVs first. So I think about 2008, I first joined discussions about EBVs. And it was quite a struggle to get where we got. And what Dany is showing is some really cool papers, but they're only from 2019, right? So it's about after 10 years that the EBV framework really started to be successful and started to catch on a lot of scientists, mostly in the beginning. And it really started also to have an impact on data flows. Next slide, please, Patty. So in a European research project that we were doing, we were looking, for instance, at different policy instruments that you can see on the left and which EBV classes were actually used in the reporting. Because a lot of the science went into how do you connect data to indicators, but we did not do a lot of work yet on how that got represented in the policy reports. And what you, for instance, can see here is that completely on your left, you have the class of genetic composition, which was really not much used. And this is only mentioned in the different objectives. It's not even data use yet. And I really think that the EBV framework helped to get a recognition worldwide that we really needed more information, knowledge, and data on this category of biodiversity in order to really capture what was going on. So I really see an essential variable as an approach that can help you identify what data is still missing and that should be used to make informed decisions. Next slide, please, Betty. So at the same time that the EBVs were starting to catch on, IPBES was starting to get into being, and multiple scientists were producing lots of papers on their own indicators saying that this is the indicator that should be taken on board. Often it was either papers based on the data that they had or completely theoretical papers without regard of whether data was available on the space and time needed for monitoring. And at the same time, we had these decision makers that were starting to get really interested in including ecosystem services in global outlooks, national ecosystem services reports, assessments. So it was a very interesting time. And from the GEO1 working group, we had multiple efforts going into the development of the EESVs and trying to capture exactly what it was that would be essential variables for ecosystem services, and how that then would link to data, indicators, and reporting. And one such effort that we did was we looked at the bias in ecosystem services reporting, given that they could only use the indicators for which data already existed into these reports. And what you can see here is that a lot of the cultural services, and you don't see that as clearly here, were represented by demand indicators. So data that shows how much, for instance, people appreciate certain nature areas. Supply indicators for provisioning services, exactly how much fish or how much grain could be harvested. And regulating services seem to be focused on a combination of demand and supply indicators, usually in the occurrence of flooding, or let's stick to flooding, which was basically insufficient supply in comparison to demand. So we also noticed that some things were completely lacking. For instance, the social cultural values of ecosystem services were not included at all, whereas we know that especially if you do larger scale assessments, this really differs. And what we also saw that the indicators that were used did not really allow for trend analysis. On the one hand, because if you have for one ecosystem services only indication of how the demand is changing, or only how the supply is changing, you still don't know what the general trend is. So these were all ingredients that really captured our attention and made it for us clear that a framework for using essential variables could be maybe a tool that could help us forward here. Next slide, please, Patty. So when we started off, we had multiple efforts from the working group on this, but when we specifically started off with this paper, I think that we focused on facilitating progress on two fronts. And the first was to identifying which aspects of the ecosystem services data was actually needed, and not only the data that is now available, but really needed to be of relevance for management and policies decisions. And that could then in turn guide progress in ecosystem services research, but also start monitoring of data that was currently non-existent. And what was also very new is if you would use an essential variable approach, then you would come up with a conceptual framework that would be independent of nomenclatures, because that was a really big thing then, and maybe still now, about exactly which name you give a service. And also scale and data types, because you want essential variables basically integrate data from different sources together to get the trend. And it's also nice, what I like about the framework is that, at least how it's applied for EBVs, is that it can just be improved or complemented over time as our understanding of ecosystem services and our values of ecosystem services changes over time. Next slide, please, Patty. So Patty will talk more about the process that went into this, but let's say it's just generally was a long time to get everyone's views on board, to have multiple visions represented. Every time we had a new author on board, it was really an interesting discussion to get an agreement on terms. But I think that what you see here, this is one of the figures from the paper, is that as it is true for sustainability, it's true for ecosystem services for essential variables, that everything is connected. So essential variables were already established for instance, the essential ocean variables. We've got essential climate variables. The essential biodiversity variables are maybe the newest one to be added to this. And now there are EESVs. And if you on the let's say the blueprint of this figure is actually the framework as it was developed by EESVs on how the different aspects are connecting nature to people and vice versa. And I think that's really, yeah, I find it very strong that the EESVs that were now developed fit so nicely into this overview. And with that, I would like to pass the word to Patty.
Thank you, Ilse. Okay, so these essential variables. So the process, as Ilse said and Dany mentioned, is quite long. So if we go all the way back to the creation of the working group and several of the papers that both Dany and Ilse have highlighted, they all set the stage for thinking about this. Then we run several workshops with different types of communities. So for instance, with the Program for Ecosystem Change and Society, we held 2 workshops in 2015 and 2017. With GEO Bond, we held 3 workshops at the GEO Bond conferences in 2016, 17, and 19, but also held online consultations to the community at large of how first the ideas that were feeding into the conceptualization of these essential variables, but also on exploring how much people were comfortable with the variables that were already starting to be put forward. Also, other members of the team were thinking more about monitoring, for instance, ecosystem services through Earth observations, well, this is a synthesis handbook, and of course, the EESVs global assessment was in a way working in parallel and allow us to think how much these processes could feed into each other. And also the United Nations system from environmental ecosystem accounting was being developed. And we also held meetings to explore how much we were on the same page and converging towards a useful framework. So the framework, as Dany and Ilse showed, is these core variables, no? The minimum set of core variables in this particular case, as Ilse showed, to inform about the left half of the diagram of the EESV conceptual framework, which is the interactions between nature and society that contribute to human well-being. And through these ecosystem services or this conceptualization of nature's contributions to people. And we decided to go for classes rather that represent shared and group key attributes of these variables that then could encompass several specific variables and to be able to monitor through space and time. So the first class is ecological supply, which is the ecosystem structure and functions, no, that underlie the potential capacity of ecosystems to provide these services or contributions to people. So as Dany said, of course, depending on what species and how many individuals of the species are available determines, for instance, the fishing potential, but also like the diversity and the climatic conditions that determine what kinds of species are available and what kind of functions are most critical to humans also regulate this ecological supply. The anthropogenic contribution is this, apart from this discussion has been going on for several years now on the co-production of ecosystem services. That was a big shift. So when, if you remember, when Gretchen Daly defined ecosystem services, it was a bit like the pristine nature providing these services to nurture people. But during the Millennium Assessment, it was very clear that humans played a key role in the supply of these services. And then papers, for instance, by Paloma and others started to highlight this anthropogenic contribution, which is also very important part of the ideas underpinning the nature's contribution to people and the people's contributions to nature. So this anthropogenic contribution are the efforts that humans invest to enhance the ecological supply and make use of these services or contributions. And this can be all the way from physical infrastructure, both financial capital, knowledge, time invested to foster this supply. Then we can very clearly differentiate the demand, and the demand for these ecosystem services can be explicit or implicit. So sometimes this demand is very clearly connected, for instance, in this picture, connected to wool and the different species that are used to dye the wool to prepare these gorgeous carpets in the Central Valley of Oaxaca, but also the demand for services or contribution that are implicitly expressed, like all the issues related to soil fertility and the maintenance of all these soil functions and its regulations sometimes are not so clearly expressed, but are very clearly connected to agricultural production. So there are these human desires or needs for a service or a contribution in terms of a particular quantity of quality, and whether awareness exists for this need or not, as the discussion, for instance, for the regulation of climate change show, the need for climate change regulation is there, whether people are completely conscious or not about this or not. Then the use would be this actual appropriation of the service or the contribution by people that can be active or passive. So just harvesting the different ingredients for a meal and preparing a meal is this active appropriation, of course, but then you could have the use of the water canals, the passive impacts on microclimate regulation or on implications for psychological well-being. We wanted to emphasize the importance of value, and as you know, the concept of ecosystem services is a concept that is very linked to people's needs. So instrumental value is very important because it's about how this service or contribution is important to society or individual as a means to achieve a specific end or contribute to a particular dimension of human well-being. So for instance, when harvesting coffee, we can think about the value connected to monetary gains from the harvest, but also all the values connected to the taste and so on, or the regulation, for instance, the role played by coastal ecosystems in regulating the impacts of strong hydrometeorological events or sea level rise. But as you probably know, there's been a recent emphasis in the relational values, which are about the importance ascribed to how ecosystems contribute to meaningful interactions between humans and nature, or between humans in the context of nature. So these relational values have to do with people's livelihoods and how people connect to undertake different activities and to base their identity or their social connections in the context of nature. And of course, these values, these more moral values associated with ideas of what a good life, what eudaimonia means, and how they are connected with nature in the context of human-to-human relations. And so these essential ecosystem service variables are strongly interconnected, no? So supply is strongly linked to demand because, of course, must not, I guess, supply must exceed demand if the flow is to be sustainable. Of course, these instrumental values are strongly connected to demand. Use is really sitting at the intersection between supply, anthropogenic contribution, and demand, but also this human-to-human interaction lead to anthropogenic contribution and use and are based on these instrumental and relational values. So as Ilse said, we think about this proposal as a very first step of these classes that apply to all ecosystem services, irrespective of the type of ecosystem service, the conceptualization, the typologies used, and so on. So I leave the floor to Valia.
Thank you, Patty. So hello, everybody from me as well. I'm Valia Drakou, and I will be talking about the next step. So how do we actually go from these classes of essential ecosystem service variables to the variables and the links with data? Next slide, please. So what we did based on the proposed framework, we tried to really take 3 core examples and see how we can actually operationalize these. And we chose examples that are different. We tried to cover different social ecological contexts and different types of ecosystem services as well. So we took wild food from fisheries as a provisioning service. We took crop pollination by by bees, and we as a regulating one, and physical and psychological experiences from wildlife viewing as a cultural service. And what we tried to do, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, but what we wanted to understand is how does existing knowledge and indicators that we have available can help us really inform these essential ecosystem service variables and help us monitor these human nature interactions across different scales and resolutions. We looked at available data for all different types of classes, and we also assessed the feasibility of what we are proposing as an indicator based on what we have available, but also based on the extent to which the data that we have available can directly inform these essential variables, or whether we really need to process the data through different kinds of steps, and the extents and resolutions at which all the information that we have available was given to us. And we use this in traffic light system to indicate the level of feasibility of our variables. Next slide, please. So I'm gonna give you an example of the process. I also would like to mention that because of the complexity of ecosystem services and this social ecological interaction that is inherent within this concept, as it has already been mentioned, we really we formed sub-working groups that were interdisciplinary in order to be able to really trace these and test these essential variables. So this is just an indication, for example, for the ecological supply class that Patty just explained. For the fisheries ecosystem service, we propose the biomass of these marine species that are consumed by humans, and we traced data from global data sets that is already available. For example, for this fishery type, we have information from large online data sets like the Sea Around Us project. We also assessed the extent to which this is feasible, and here we gave it, for example, this orange traffic light, because it is not available for all kinds of species, but we have for many of them. We also have a coverage at, for example, the exclusive economic zone level, but for some monitoring, we might need also different extents. So there's still work that needs to be done to cover these. We also assess the relevance that the variables that we are proposing have with existing indicators that IPBES has proposed, like in that case, the global assessment of IPBES referred to this proportion of fish stocks within biologically sustainable levels. So this also allows us to see a need for the development or for the improvement of the proposed essential variables that we are talking about. Similarly, we did the same for the wild pollinators availability and abundance and diversity for crop pollination. And in that case, we really detected data that is based on land use and land cover information. And we also, and because there's further processing that needs to be done and the workflows that are available to really streamline these data for the development of the essential variables is still a work in progress. This was also highlighted as an orange one. On the contrary, when we really went to the cultural or recreational services of wildlife viewing and the experiences that humans get out of it, our variable was the availability of megafauna based on the recreational opportunities they offer. And there we really have much more comprehensive data set. We have the IUCN Red list of species, which can help us inform and monitor in a good temporal and spatial resolution, how this kind of variable is subject to change over time and space. And for these, there are also relevant indicators from the IPBES, from different IPBES assessment. It was not only the global one, but also the Europe and Central Asia. And this was the practice that we followed. We followed a similar approach for all classes of EESVs. I'm not going to really go through all the details of those, but going back to what Ilse mentioned before about this process, similar to the EBVs, what this really highlighted is where we really need to invest our research in order to get better and more data. So, for example, for many of these proposed variables, when we talk about anthropogenic contribution for provisioning and cultural services, this to a large extent was the data we traced was related to accessibility, or we have for fisheries the Global Fishing Watch, which traces all the fishing boat routes, for example. So there we have information available, but when we talk about the agricultural, the crop pollination from wild insects, there we need to process more data, we need remote sensing information, we need to improve the information that we have. Next slide. And this is an overview of the rest of the classes for demand, use, and the instrumental and relational values. And as you can see also from the traffic lights, these are really changing, and they're different depending on the type of value that we are looking of variable that we are looking at. When we talk about values, then relational values are the hardest to monitor over space and time, but we already detected, we have the UNESCO Cultural Heritage Database, for example, which offers information about some of these services. For fisheries, we have information about demand. We know about their culture, their nutritional values, but some of them, they really still are work in progress. Next slide. Next slide, please.
It is coming, yeah.
Yeah, so, okay. So this whole working, this effort was very challenging, we have to say, and these tables that you can also see with more detail on the paper as well, they have changed structure and content way too many times. And this is because the processes that we were trying to cover with these essential variables, they were really operating at different scales and levels. For instance, the supply or the ecological supply, or the demand for a service, or even the values that aspire to these services, they could really occur at different spatial scales. And this also makes challenging to find and detect data and variables that can cover, that can span across all these classes that we detected for essential variables. And based on all these challenges that we faced also during this process, we did learn a lot of things, and we also thought that it would be important to propose 3 action points for the future. The first one is that we propose that for the development and testing and operationalization of these essential variables of ecosystem services, we need to form interdisciplinary expert panels, because even within the same ecosystem services, we require disciplines from ecology, biophysical sciences to social and economic expertise. But at the same time, we also need collaboration across different ecosystem service experts, especially because many of the data that we have detected that can inform the development of these variables can really serve and inform variables that span across different classes as well. And lastly, we are also proposing the operationalization of this global ecosystem service monitoring system that was proposed by GEO, I think a year or 2 ago, through a systematic approach that can be really supported by these proposed essential variables. And then I'll pass the floor to Anna. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Valia. Also warm welcome from my side. My name is Anna Kort. I'm working at the University of Dresden in Germany. And I would like to broaden the view a bit more, building on what Valia just presented by talking about how in general we can monitor ecosystem services, and in particular the EESVs, and also deliver some data products. So in my presentation, I'm also going to cover some additional efforts that have been carried out by the working group and related people while we were developing the EESVs. Next slide, please. Yes, so to me, monitoring EESV is really, it's a major challenge, but to me, it's a major adventure. And as it has been highlighted by the other presentations, Patty mentioned it already, and also Ilse referred to it, the EESV classes that we propose, they are really closely interrelated, which means if we really want to achieve a full monitoring of ecosystem service trends, this means that we need to be able to require monitoring changes in all ecosystem, in all essential variables as well. So luckily, or maybe this is a challenge and adventure at the same time, we are really in the age of big data. So we see that more and more data on the trends of nature, also on the trends of society, and in particular on the interactions are generated every day and at different spatial and temporal resolution. The problems we all face in our research, and I don't think this is something specific to ecosystem services or essential ecosystem service variables, is that often these data are not interoperable and they are not comparable across scales, across contexts. And a particular challenge that has been also mentioned here before in this webinar is the types of ecosystem services, because they are just so different and largely covered by different research communities. So, we have been in the working group discussing this topic of different, or how to best integrate different data sets quite a lot. So this is a figure from a paper that was related together with this working group. And as the figure shows, just some examples of data that we are often using in ecosystem service models in particular. This is the focus. So we need to integrate different sorts of spatial data, like polygon data. We need to work with tabular information covering socioeconomic information, points, grids, and so on. And we particularly looked into how these data can be integrated to improve models, which still play a crucial role in monitoring and getting information on ecosystem services. We've been looking quite a bit into the potential of Earth observations in this respect, where we see a lot of support to provide additional information in terms of the input for such ecosystem service models, and also helping us to calibrate and validate the models and also the outputs. And and this is also going to be an important part of our work in GeoBon and in further developing the ecosystem service, the essential ecosystem service variables. Next slide, please.
Sometimes it's very slow for some
Yeah,
reason.
I know.
It won't come.
Your laptop is sleepy.
Well, it depends. Sometimes it's happy to go quickly, sometimes it's not. So let's see. I will click again. Hope it's not too much. There you are.
Okay, so just a few thoughts on the next steps and opportunities. So and to me, this is a community decision. I mean, we have proposed as co-authors the idea of essential ecosystem service variables. Let's see how it's taken up, or if it's taken up. If it's taken up, for sure, we need more systematic monitoring efforts, and we also need to build on the kind of existing ecosystem service monitoring efforts. Valia already mentioned a few of them. What is crucial is we still need a better understanding of the pros and cons, and also of the trade-offs of different approaches, how we can monitor ecosystem services. And the figure on the lower right shows us what we would actually like to have. So in the middle, you see a perfect ecosystem service model, which is able to cover like both the natural sciences and social sciences side, so everything from the social side and demand to biophysical supply, and at the same time to cover spatial scales, which always turn out as one of the major challenges when it comes to monitoring. So being able to integrate from local place-based research to global and more generalized results. What is a great opportunity to me is that we can build on especially the remote sensing based efforts that have been developed over the last few years for monitoring the essential biodiversity variables. And for some of the ecosystem services, and especially for some of the classes that we propose, there is more overlap certainly with the EBVs than for others. But we really see a lot of opportunities to build on that. And also to build on the latest development in ecosystem services research. And the other figure I put there is related to the use of social media information, for example, which sparked a lot of research and interest in the cultural ecosystem services community. So what we need for sure, and I just want to emphasize that again, is really inter and transdisciplinary research approaches and working groups. So this is nothing to be only done by this working group, but really by the community at large. If we want to be able to develop research approaches and monitoring frameworks that are able to cover the essential ecosystem service variables, this really needs a big effort. And what we also need is collaboration between the data producers on the one hand side, and also the data users, and also between science and policy. And with that keyword, I would hand over to Kate.
Thank you, Anna. I have the fun part of talking about why this is so desperately needed and that this work will really be used. Patty, next slide. I'll talk primarily about the IPBES global assessment because that's the one that I'm most familiar with, but this is quite relevant to all of the IPBES assessments, to the HE biodiversity targets, and quite frankly, to any global scale monitoring efforts that are happening. The brief for most of these assessments at their core is to monitor the status and trends, and doing that requires data. And that's something that to date, we haven't been able to do very well. Patty, next slide, please. So this is a figure from the summary for policymakers of the IPBES assessment. This is really looks exactly like what the policymakers wanted to see. And of note, it really emphasizes biophysical supply. It is quite qualitative. So we're talking about more versus less kind of trends. And they want a number for the world. We indicated whether or not the directional trends were uniform globally or whether they varied across regions. But the fact of the matter is that there was a huge demand for a single number. And in this particular case, there was still quite a lot of interest in emphasizing biophysical supply. And I can tell you that we desperately, desperately wanted this effort to already have happened because we would have had much better data to do even this part. But Patty, if you'll go on to the next slide. We did actually look at not just the biophysical supply, but also the output and the impact of what those benefits to people actually had on people, and there was very little data available. We were primarily looking at literature. It was one-off assessments that covered different time periods. There was not a breadth of literature or data to look at and really make an integrated assessment. And so there's a tremendous need for this. And it's not true just for ecosystem services. So if we move to the next slide, Patty. IPBES and many of these assessments have been looking at, in addition to ecosystem services or nature's benefits to people, explicitly, they've also been looking into things like other global goals. So the HE biodiversity targets are one of the most important. In the summary of progress towards those HE targets in the IPBES global assessment, as you can see, many of the progress pieces were unknown, and the quantification is poor, moderate, or good. So there's really very little information when we get to ecosystem services in the HE monitoring. And it's of note to say that obviously the HE biodiversity targets, the essential biodiversity variables are very important for that, but that, as you can see in goal D, enhancing the benefits to all, there are actually a lot of parts of the HE targets that go beyond just monitoring biodiversity. And that's something that these essential ecosystem services variables can really inform. Next slide, please, Patty. IPBES also looked at the sustainable development goals, and the sustainable development goals are something that will continue to be really important. What you can see in this figure, and I've purposely made it very small so you don't get distracted by what each of the goals and targets are, but what you can see here is that these were assessed, they were really assessed via literature, and they got as far as poor declining, a little bit of support, or we just don't know. So again, policymakers are asking for this information. They're writing targets of global goals that are internationally agreed on into agreements, and we just don't have the data yet. And so there's a tremendous demand for the kind of work that these essential ecosystem services variables are pushing towards. Next slide, please, Patty. And this will continue. So the first part of the Convention on Biological Diversity's meeting looking towards the post-2020 biodiversity goals happened in October, and the second half of that meeting will happen in May of this year. It is the post-2020 goals that got pushed back a little bit because of the pandemic. So we're still working on those, but they are going to happen. That's very much in process right now. So there's going to be, again, a tremendous demand for these kinds of data points and monitoring information in order to say what we can say about them. And similarly, IPBES continues to move forward. 2 new assessments have just been initiated, looking at the nexus assessment and the transformative change assessment. Again, nature's benefits to people, ecosystem services are going to be central to these, and being able to really monitor what's happening with them is important. And I'll note also that you know, this kind of consistent ecosystem services monitoring, it doesn't just tell us about what the outcomes are. It actually helps us understand the process better. There's really cool science that needs to be done and will be done because of collecting and integrating all of this information. Next slide, please, Patty. And I'm not sure if Patty or Odie or anyone else wants to speak at the end, but that's really where our presentation ends, because as you can see, what we've brought to the table here is a framework that has a lot of input from a lot of people and really tries to make sense of all the great science that's happening, organize it and drive it forward. But it's clearly not the end all and be all, as especially Valia and Anna were talking about, we need to actually do this. And so our hope for this webinar is that we can really have a discussion about what happens to move forward. Where do we take this? How do we make this happen to inform those forthcoming assessments, the new EESVs, the new Convention on Biodiversity, the Sustainable Development Goals, because there is such a big demand for this information. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kate. Should I stop sharing, right, to leave the floor to Maria?
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for being there, and thank you for all the very good exposures. Well, we have very interesting questions. So first of all, Raisa is asking Ilse, made a question for Ilse. How, Ilse, you mentioned how all the EVs are connected, but also noted that there was a conscious decision to keep the EESVs separate from EVVs. Did you coordinate the development and framework of the EESVs with the other EVs, EOV, ECVs, while EVs can help how we assess and communicate changes in nature? I could imagine that there is also the risk to naturally connected assessment and data flows by having multiple disconnected framework. Do you have a strategy to avoid such a disconnect?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm answering this on behalf of all the other co-authors, so they will jump in. So the different essential variables frameworks that we showed in the picture, they've all had different origins. I think that I don't know if the essential ocean variables were before climate, but I think that the EESVs are the only one that really bridge between nature and human through ecosystem services. So in that sense, that's what they add to the other groups of essential variables that are already out there. The climate variables also obviously had a really focused target audience, which was the IPCC. The ocean variables also had their own very targeted outlook that they were going for. EBVs maybe were a bit different in that they were definitely oriented towards CBDs, but they really tried to capture also what was going on in observation networks around the world, so at a very local scale. But I think that Dany put it very well that, you know, if you try to link the ecosystem service variables solely to the EBVs, then you're missing a lot of the human part in ecosystem services. But having said that, within the working group from GEOBON, we have already tried to make the connections between, so GEOBON has different working groups, one on the different actually classes of EVV. So we've been trying to see how we could use the data that's already available through these working groups and these models and see how we can connect them to the EESVs. So in that sense, we've been really trying to connect. And it's one of the reasons also why we included, for instance, the marine example in the paper. I hope that that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ilse. Just to add to this answer, we should say that Ori is coordinating a group to study the connection between the different EVs with the EESVs. So if you're interested in that line of research, you can contact Ori. I don't know, Ori, if you want to tell a little bit more about that.
There's not much more to add, Maria. Thanks. It's that I think, and people have posted a couple of papers in the chat as well that are hinting at some connection of different EBVs to EESVs. So I think that program of work is going to be developing now that we have the EESVs in hand. We can start making those connections a bit more explicit now. Thanks.
Well, another question from Elva Escobar. She wrote it when Valia was talking, but it could be answered by any one of you. Why is water not considered as a cross-cutting connection, connecting ecosystem services, being also a habitat for biodiversity that has been highly affected by human use?
Maybe I can start answering. So if you remember, maybe I can, well, I could share a screen, but doesn't matter. So in the potential supply, this is where we emphasize the current condition of the ecosystem. And so, as we said, for instance, in marine systems, it really depends what species are there, how thriving or not are the populations, and so on, in order to be able to supply the service. So for us, the human impacts in changing abundance of species, composition, and so on, and the productivity is in this supply part. But this is, of course, very interconnected to the demand. We actually have an example from the fisheries world in the paper where, of course, the demand for certain fish affect the population for others and so on. So what we are trying, what I think Anna has emphasized is that in order to move forward, rather than trying to have supply for all the services available or the 18 categories of nature's contributions to people, maybe start with one, but make sure you have all the classes of variables and you really understand these interconnections, because it's this interconnection that will allow you to understand not only the trends, but also why these trends are happening and where and how to take action.
Can I also add something to that? I'm not sure if this was the question was about the fisheries example only. I guess it's coming from there. But one thing that it's also important is that what we are, the exercise that we carried out when we tried really to describe and define these essential variables did not really mean that we are exhausting all information related to these ecosystem services. And this was the concept of essential variables. So we don't, we're trying to find data and information that can give us an indication of the change in the most efficient way and also a rapid one. So we tried also to somehow, we did not, the examples that we had here with data is not the only ones that we have available. We made a selection, and this is aimed to give inspiration to add more, but this doesn't mean that this is exhaustive. And water, for example, is monitored, and water quality is monitored, at least in Europe. We have the water strategy, the water framework directive. We have indicators for that. That could also be another indicator. But when we talk about food from fisheries, we targeted firstly the biomass of the species, because this was also the main, let's say, element of the service that we were looking at. But of course, this is all we're saying. Ecosystem services have multiple aspects. It's not only one variable that we will add in the system, but the monitoring needs some kind of focus to detect change.
Thank you, Valia. Well, Donalda is asking, is making a question about the the databases that exist. Considering the data, the demand to quantify ecosystem services, how do you see the potential to use databases at the country level, or just, or shall the resolution for the data much be higher? That is a very interesting question. And Gary Geller also asked about how can remote sensing help to fill the gaps in the data needed. Perhaps Anna, you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, I mean, my personal opinion on this is like, it depends. I mean, it depends on the question of what you would like to monitor. Dany in the beginning showed like one of the early studies looking at like more the country level into trends of ecosystem services and so on and so forth. So I think for getting in like a global overview of the declines that we're interested in, this is certainly these data have a value. But if you're interested in understanding more details of the like spatial temporal drivers and changes especially in the levels of the different EESV classes, we need higher resolution data for that, I think, both in a higher spatial resolution, but also in terms of higher temporal resolution, because many of these national data we have, like the best we get is like an annual level, but sometimes we have them every 5 or every 10 years. So I would say, yes, I see the value in those in this information, but it really depends on the question we would like to ask. But I already see Patty raising her hand, no?
Yeah, so I think that that's a very good point. And what we did in this first paper was just to think what kind of data would be available now, no, for undertaking a global assessment. And as you saw, sometimes the resolution is at the national scale or not even the national scale, depending on the source. But of course, as you know, there are some ongoing efforts, no, like this paper published a couple of years ago from the Natural Capital Project on the very high resolution maps for 3 nature's contributions to people. I think it was a contribution of pollination to the supply of minerals, the retention of nitrogen and coastal and protection from level sea rise and impacts from these severe, so coastal protection. But as you know, I mean, it takes years to develop these models. And so I think the strategy is a big mix. I think a bit as Anna showed, we really need to walk in parallel in several areas. I think Kate showed that the EPES assessments, for instance, need to be done, and they're not done with good enough data. So even if we had national level trends like Dany showed, that's a good start. And these could already start showing some trends. But of course, the ideally would be to have much higher resolution. I guess we just need a mixed strategy and to join forces. We really think there's a very strong connection between the different teams working in the essential biodiversity variables, the EBVs, to connect the biological part to the supply. But of course, we also need to link to other communities that work with the demand and with all the, for instance, the relational values, instrumental values.
I'm seeing maybe a sentiment rather than a question in the chat, that there's always a need for more data, but at the same time, it seems there is a lot of data. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about this.
Well, I can go ahead.
Yeah, I think that, yes, there's a lot of data out there. And I think that in the beginning, when we started working with the working group, we looked at multiple ways of how to use the available data. But I think the lessons learned from the EBVs is that this conceptual framework can help you identify what data is actually still needed, even though that data stream is not yet here. And I fully support Patty in her remark that the framework allows us also to connect different communities that might not be in interactions, have not been in interaction so far. And hence you hope that it actually allows for new data streams to connect, but also what is a very big part of the EBV framework and also the EESVs is the question, how do you integrate different data streams, right? So whether it's remote sensing with local observations, with sensory data of household use of ecosystems, this needs to come together. And I think still a lot of work is needed in order to be able to make sense across different kind of data sets and what is actually happening in the ecosystem services.
Kind of echoing what Ilse just said, to me, the benefits of this framework is all about sort of identifying what are the key data gaps and how we can sort of unsilo these communities that have very important but different data streams. And so what I think that was really effective, what Ilse was describing earlier, is this idea that we might have a lot of information about the supply, the biophysical supply of a bunch of services derived from remote sensing or from species distribution models or the EBV type of framework. But then we would lack the key information about who is using those services or how they're actually benefiting people. And therefore, we don't have a complete picture in order to understand how that ecosystem service is going to be changing and who's going to be benefiting from it globally. And so that data might not exist, or it could be that it's just really siloed, where it's a very different community of kind of the remote sensing world, kind of developing these models of supply, and then more on the kind of social science side of people doing the kind of household surveys or other types of data collection efforts that would generate information on value. And so by really clearly delineating these different kind of stages of this ecosystem service delivery, essentially the essential ecosystem service variables, you really clearly identify how you need to have all of this information present to truly understand a service and where the data is actually a gap and where we actually need to integrate across sort of disciplines or kind of groups of people.
Well, thank you.
Can I follow up on one of the comments by Gary that he asked earlier about like the potential of remote sensing data? And now I think Gary asked for a list of questions and how remote sensing data can help and what type of data we would actually like to have. So this is a topic I've been working on like a few years ago with many people also in the working group. And I still see there's a lot of potential in monitoring ecosystem services with remote sensing data. And for sure, I mean, now the classes as they were presented, the biggest potential is surely on the ecological supply and but also on the anthropogenic contribution, for example. So as we discussed earlier, like ecological supply really has a huge overlap, to me at least, with what is monitored or what needs to be monitored for the EBVs. But then when we look into anthropogenic contribution, things like infrastructure and access and things like that are really important. And I'm not at the very core of the remote sensing community anymore, but I think this is also a bit disparate in our separate groups, let's say, with different research communities within the remote sensing community that work with different sensors, with different spectral and spatial resolutions and so on. So I think maybe the EBVs, the EESVs can actually also help to bridge some bridge some gaps within the remote sensing community. That would be an interesting endeavor, but I see that if we want to cover the EESVs with remote sensing, we really need to make the use the full range of available techniques. So the first classes that were mentioned are the ones where I see the most potential. And I'm happy. This is a really nice question. I'm happy to work together with you guys on developing more specific needs in terms of some more specific proposals of which remote sensing data would make sense here. Yeah, so thanks a lot for the comment.
Well, we still have 10 minutes of this. I want to say something before the webinar ends. Today marks the International Day for Women's Rights. On different claims are made regarding political rights, economic rights, and in general human rights. That is the right to work, to not being discriminated, not the non-violence, and the equal treatment in general for humans, women, among other historical demands. This year, the United Nations Women stated that the theme of the International Women's Day this year will be Gender Equality Today for Sustainable Tomorrow. And I wanted to put this idea in the desk today, because women have a very important role in sustainability sciences in general. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that the Ecosystem Services Working Group is open to new members. So everybody is invited to join us, and especially women and and dissidences. But not just women, but people from all over the world, and in the different countries too, not just Europe or United States, but also Latin America, Africa, or Asia, that perhaps we have less representation of those countries. And well, just to tell you that we are rethinking the action plan of the working group, and undoubtedly the EESVs framework will be in all the discussions and putting new research ideas for the group. So, well, if you want to join us, I will leave you my email and Ori's email, so you can write us and get involved. Well, Ori, which other question, or Ori or the rest of the team? I don't know if there are still some questions, because Vicente Guadalupe asked about how and who can articulate to develop more use cases of application of the EESVs approach. And responding, Guadalupe, this will be the place, the Ecosystem Services Working Group of GEOBON will be the place where we should work in this concept, articulating and putting the EESVs at work in empirical cases, and well, searching, of course, or searching new indicators for EESVs, not just in the global level, but also in the local level.
So, if I may, I would like to say that this effort has been led and implemented in the context of GEOBON, but we all know there's a huge community of people working on ecosystem services. So the ideas are there, the framework is there for anyone to apply it at any scale they are working, in any context they are working. And so I think it's an invitation to really connect this monitoring with actual decision making, and to use this framework to more strategically think what are the key data streams and how to combine them into these essential ecosystem service variable classes and individual variables. In particular, in the context of the GEOBON working group, as Maria said, I mean, that's a very interesting opportunity, because then there's people from all over the world that do not know each other, have not been working together, but they can come together in a different place. And because of the very wide nature of GEO in general, the global Earth observation systems goes way beyond only biodiversity observation network. So I think through the GEO at large network, there's very interesting opportunities, a bit like Anna and Gary are chatting right now, to connect data streams that have not really been interconnected, and basically to deliver data products that can be used very easily by decision makers at different scales.
Yes, it is very interesting to have this group working, because there are lots of scientists of different disciplines around the world working in different indicators for monitoring ecosystem services in general. So it is important to know each other between us and be connected, but not only be connected. It's important, but it's also important to have a framework organizing all our work that we are doing individually in our own institutes. You know that GeoBond is a voluntary network. We don't earn money for participating here. So it is important to have our own projects in our own institutes, but coordinate this huge task about monitoring ecosystem services in an organized way. So that is GeoBond, and well, I think that is very important, not only to have a wide representation across the world, as I said, and across the gender and dissidences in general, but also in the, different disciplines. So we also encourage people from other disciplines to participate here, because to map EESVs, it is very important not just to have biological scientists or sustainability scientists, but also social scientists, for example, or psychologists, or different disciplines that are not usually involved in general.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, so I hope this inspired some of you to maybe come and visit the working group, or some of you to contribute some of the gaps that were identified. And I see some really interesting developments in the chats about some questions being asked and some potential collaborations forming there. And this is also an invitation to say, because the as you can see, the framework is a sort of like the start of the conversation to bring all the different aspects of ecosystem services together. Well, typically when we speak about ecosystem services, we are referring to something specific. We are maybe talking about ecosystem services supply, but we just say ecosystem services. Somebody else is talking about ecosystem services demand. And so by naming and being more explicit about what aspect of that chain we are talking about, it becomes also easier to link different data from different parts. So it'll be really fun, hopefully, to start exploring some of the how to make different components of this framework more implementable, start developing more variables around this, as well as especially thinking about data. I think for people who said data is available, it'll be good to bring it on board, and also where data is not available, to think about what are the different ways of we talked a lot about remote sensing in here, but we know from some work here in South Africa and other parts that you can also start bringing household survey data that gets a lot at the use of ecosystem services. So we can start thinking about, for each of those different classes, what are some of the data that are maybe typically not used in ecosystem services monitoring that can be brought into the fold to start moving this a bit forward. But yeah, thank you everybody. And I don't know if there's any other last questions we've missed, or other comments from any of the speakers that you want to say. We have 4 more minutes we can use if we need.
Well, if you still have questions or things to share, we will have soon, probably next month, a meeting with the Ecosystem Services Working Group. And we can keep discussing all these ideas in this meeting to organize next action plan of the group. Patty, Ilse, Valia, Dany, Kate, Anna, do you want to say some final words in this webinar? You are invited to close.
Well, just I think what we shared with Ilse, well, a bit as Dany said, these efforts go back to a long time ago, and where well, the seeds were put in the ground by the people that started this working group, no? And Halmuni had this idea in mind and to operationalize it, and Heather Tallis and Belinda Reyes were the first leads. And then we developed this work for many, many years. And we are so happy to finally be able to share it with you. There were all kinds of obstacles in the way, as sometimes happen, from all categories of personal, academic, the world, COVID, upside down, and all that. But it's so great to be able to share with all of you. And please use it, question it, if it's helpful, good, if it needs to be refined, better, whatever is needed. We're so happy it's out there.
Well, thank you very much to everybody for participating, for being here. And of course, thank you very much to Patty, Kate, Dany, Valia, Ilse, and Dana for your talks. And I also want to make a special mention to Adriana Radulovici. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it well, but she was behind all the organization of this webinar, giving us support. So there's Adriana, she turned on her camera. So thank you very much to everybody. I hope to see you again in our next meeting of the Ecosystem Services Working Group. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much
Bye.
for being here.
Thank you.